Japan dissolves its parliament and heads to a snap election. But will it give the Prime Minister a stronger mandate to take on North Korea? I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is Shinzo Abe. Twice in the past month, Pyongyang has fired missiles over Japan. The Prime Minister's response: to send the country not to bomb shelters, but to voting booths. Shinzo Abe is taking his chances to strike while the iron's hot by going to the polls at a time when his approval ratings are surging and the opposition seems weak. He says snap elections are the only way to deal with the national crisis. But because Japanese MPs have been sent home, business in the national diet has come to a halt, and attention now turns from governing to campaigning. Critics say dissolving parliament may be a ploy to distract from his alleged corruption scandals. Still, Abe's betting his party makes gains in next month's election. But will the gamble pay off?
A missile launched from North Korea last month aimed at rattling Japan. It sparked military defense drills near the capital. And now this.
むしろ私はこういう時期にこそ選挙を行うことによってこの北朝鮮問題への対応について国民の皆さんに問いたいと思います。
Japan's Prime Minister called a snap vote for October 22nd, a year earlier than planned, citing security. But Abe's critics don't agree with his timing, saying an election will only create a political vacuum, making the country less safe. The Prime Minister seems confident he can secure a third term and become the longest-serving Japanese leader since World War II, despite fresh competition. The election was announced hours after the governor of Tokyo said she was setting up a rival to Abe's ruling Liberal Democratic Party.
By creating a political environment free of vested interest, we would like to be able to deliver hope in these insecure times.
And that message has wooed MPs from other parties, including Abe's, who are attracted by Kyoki's promise to tackle Japan's ageing population problem. Her party also crushed the LDP in a local election in July. Confidence in Abe is at its lowest since 2012, following accusations he granted political favours to his wife and two friends, while a cabinet reshuffle in August only made things worse.
It really is top-down leadership. So the concern is that that top-down leadership has gotten a little bit too strong.
But a poll this week shows that Abe is having a slight bump in popularity, thanks to his defiance towards Kim Jong-un. The Prime Minister said he'll focus on childcare and early education rather than paying back Japan's huge public debt when campaigning starts on October 10th. But will it be his stance on the future of his country or the threat from North Korea that will keep him in power, if at all? Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now by Kotaro Tamura. He was a senator in Shinzo Abe's first cabinet. He's now a professor at the National University of Singapore. We also have Shihoko Goto. She's a senior Northeast Asia associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And in Tokyo, Nancy Snow. She's a professor of public diplomacy at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies, as well as the author of several books on foreign policy. Thanks all of you for joining us. Let me begin with you, Kotaro Tamura. Is this a good idea from Shinzo Abe to dissolve the lower house and call for new elections?
So it used to be a good idea, but now a bit unclear because the opposition front line is kind of improvisingly unifying themselves. And, you know, the popularity bouncing back thanks due to the North Korean missile testing. But again, his popularity is a little bit dropping. So things are unclear, but we have more than 3 weeks to go, so anything can happen.
Nancy Snow, he could become Japan's longest-serving post-war prime minister. Is this what Japan needs right now?
Well, I suppose so, but I mean, I look at this snap election as really something that Abe is doing in order to show a sense of unity within a party, the LDP, the dominant party, that is being challenged by a reformist conservative, namely Yuriko Koike, of course, the Tokyo metropolitan governor. And it seems rather self-serving. It's still worthwhile to Abe because his numbers went up, especially after the most recent missile launches that went over Hokkaido. And he wants to strengthen his hold on the LDP. It's worth the risk to him.
Yeah, Shioko Goto, let's talk about the Party of Hope, led by Yuriko Koike. Is she going to be a threat to Abe in the absence of other strong opposition? Because he seems to be going for the kill right now because the numbers are good or better after the North Korean strike. But is he maybe underestimating her and any other potential threats?
Right. Certainly, Yuriko Koike has been a survivor in Japanese politics. She had previously been with the LDP. She's been with other political parties as well. As the governor of Tokyo, she's established this new party. The new party is now merging with the existing opposition party, the Democratic Party as well. So she's certainly got the political will, she's got the stamina, she's got the name recognition, which is certainly very valuable in an election that will happen in only 3 weeks' time. So there is a lot of momentum building for her. But 3 weeks in politics, unfortunately, is not enough to really overturn the strength that the LDP has wielded. Japan currently is facing an incredibly challenging time, certainly on the foreign policy front regarding how to deal with North Korea, ensuring that the relations with the United States remain strong, dealing also with a very militarized China as well. It also has domestic issues, not least the demographic issue. So at the moment, it does seem to be in favor of Prime Minister Abe.
Mm-hmm. Kotaro Tamura, help me understand this, because we have the North Korean threat. North Korea lobs missiles over. Shinzo Abe talks tough and his support increases. What does that actually mean? I mean, Japan's not going to go to war with North Korea, is it? But what does that mean in practice? What do the Japanese people want from him, and what are they liking from what they hear him saying with regards to North Korea?
So according to my analysis, this is my opinion. So he tried to take advantage of this kind of threat because he's regarded as a national security leader. So, but allow me to share my other points as a ex-political insider. So interesting point made by Tokyo governor was, she is setting up her new party as a conservative. So, she is trying to amend the constitution, and she is in line with Prime Minister Abe's attitude toward North Korean situation. So she can be a very good, interesting option who are getting tired of Prime Minister Abe. As you have mentioned, he's the longest-serving prime minister. At the same time, media and some people, especially the Tokyo metropolitan area people, they are getting tired.
Shioko Goto, can you tell me why the main opposition party, the Democratic Party, has been so weak?
In a nutshell, they've been in the opposition and they have come up with ways to protest, but they haven't really followed through on policy. So a specific example, Prime Minister Abe decides to call this snap election. The opposition party decides to vote with their feet and protest and not be in the room. So that kind of action is good, but at the same time, there is a hunger in Japan for real concrete proposals from the opposition to deal with the very real threats. Take the issue of North Korea, whether one agrees with them or not. Abe does have a very carefully crafted plan, one that involves strong U.S.-Japan alliance. Secondly, he does want to pursue a constitutional reform so that Japan can actually enhance its military capabilities. and play a greater role in ensuring its own defense abilities as well. These are the kind of things that the LDP has made very clear. The opposition has been weak because they haven't really been able to do much except to oppose those suggestions by Abe, and it staunchly has opposed reforming the constitution as well, which has been a great stumbling block for Japan.
Nancy, there's a cynical interpretation of this move from Abe that he's merely doing it to deflect from the different various corruption scandals that he has been embroiled in. Is that too simplistic, or is there maybe a germ of truth in it?
No, that's absolutely what he's doing. But also keep in mind that here in Japan, politics is not of great interest to people. When we talk about an opposition party, it's mostly in name only. The Liberal Democratic Party has been dominant since the 1950s. It's almost like a one-party state, that with a few exceptions. So in terms of political cynicism, that's been going on for decades. My Japanese friends here never talk politics with me. It's mind-boggling, but it's true. And I think it's because they're really disengaged. And this is why Koike, even though she's been around a long time, and she's a senior, I mean, in the LDP, she's been there. She was a minister of defense, and she's not a new face, but her style is refreshing. And she also comes across as bold. I happen to be wearing the colors of her party. I didn't mean to do that, but it's exciting to me as a political scientist, because I think maybe young people I teach at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies will get a little bit more interested in Japanese politics. By and large, they're very disinterested. We focus a lot more on Japanese cuisine and culture and traditional versus modern culture, and politics is really of interest to a minority. So this always will favor someone like Abe, who is, of course, going to, like many politicians, serve his own interests and his own survival.
Shioko Goto, is that true? Broadly speaking, by and large, are the people disengaged from politics?
Is there a great interest in the political party system? No, not really. There are hardcore, staunch supporters of existing parties, not just the LDP. The Komeito party, which is supported by the Soka Gakkai, which is a religious group, they have staunch supporters, as does the Communist Party as well. But if we are looking, for instance, comparing Japan to other countries in Europe, say France, and saying, is Koike going to be the next Macron and start a new political chapter in Japan? I'm afraid the answer to that is going to be no, not really, because at the end of the day, she is part of the establishment, and she's bringing together people, but it's really not a fresh perspective, nor is it really a movement in a new direction.
Kotaro Tamura, let me ask you about pacifism. We're seeing all of this emerge in the aftermath of an existential North Korean threat. We're seeing the Japanese people happy to hear their prime minister talk tough when it comes to North Korea and want to take more concrete steps. And we've heard from all of you here that one of the reasons why someone like Koike is resonating with people is because she's also talking tough. Are we seeing the Japanese political system, led by Prime Minister Abe, step by step? Is this another pebble along the road to Japan fully moving away from its pacifist constitution?
I don't think so, but recent statistics shows people supporting Prime Minister Abe's tough attitude to North Korea. The even nuclearization of Japan, some people the support is increasing. So people take it very seriously, North Korean issues. The people are concerning about the Japan surrounding situation, not only North Korea, China in the long run. So, U.S. is kind of backing off and unpredictable. So, Japanese people, by and large, are supporting Prime Minister Abe's, tough stance against the neighbors. And I think he's taking, chances, and also, taking it privilege to amend the Constitution. So I think, constitutional amendment is not very easy, but gradually, incrementally, support to not, more defense against and more stability using defense power will be shared by the general public, I think.
Shioka, let me ask you, are we seeing this? There was a lot of, a lot of soul searching, right? A lot of soul searching for a lot of time after World War II. And there was this constitution built into the national identity, pacifism. Is that now changing? Are we seeing the evidence unfold before our eyes with things like this? And are we moving in that direction? Is this yet another example?
I think there's a disconnect between what the more hawkish members of the LDP, including the Prime Minister, want for Japan. They want the constitutional reform, which is essential for Japan to enhance its military capabilities, which is also seen as part and parcel of taking a strong stance against North Korea. But that kind of appetite for Japan to reconsider its constitution, to be a bigger military presence, is not really being followed in public. That said, it is worth bearing in mind that Japanese military spending for this fiscal year is at its highest level since World War II. That doesn't really mean much, though, because it's been so low over the years, and it's still about 1% of GDP. There is a move now, though, to increase it to by another 20% or so, which is significant. It would certainly help with Japan's missile defense systems, which would be targeting directly against North Korea. But when you compare it to countries like China, or indeed the United States, it's still very much small potatoes.
Mm-hmm. Nancy, at some point, will the Japanese say maybe attack is the best form of self-defense?
Absolutely not. I couldn't disagree more with this. I think that Japan's peace brand has worked very effectively for 70 years. And be careful what you wish for. It's one thing to have tough talk, but you're talking about Japan's self-defense forces, none of whom, not one soldier has ever fired a weapon that has killed another person. They haven't seen active war since the end of World War II. And all of this militarism talk in such a nuclearized part of the world is extremely concerning to me. We need to come up with some alternative, creative thoughts here, especially regarding the fact that this country is a cultural superpower. It's always been, it's been defanged military-wise. And I'm not sure if the world is going to want to see a Japan that is taken out from under the umbrella of the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance and becomes a much more aggressive military power on its own. Of course, I worry about North Korea, but we can't look at a limited nuclear war with North Korea or some type of first strike. It would just be catastrophic.
Shioka Goto, tell me how this is going to unfold come the end of October after those snap elections. How's it going to play out?
Abe will win with the majority. He will continue with his coalition government with the Komeito. There will be a new package to revitalize the economy, which will focus tremendously on dealing with the demographic time bomb. There should be more enhanced military spending, but it will fall short of pushing through with his initial proposal earlier this year about trying to redefine and rewrite the Japanese constitution.
Okay. Kotaro Tamura, Shioka Goto, and Nancy Snow, it's been great to talk to all of you. I thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still ahead, left in terror's wake. As Iraqi forces push Daesh out, they're struggling to know what to do with the families of the fighters. And when does protecting privacy in the UK become terrorism? We speak with a man convicted for refusing to reveal his passwords. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. When terrorists are captured or killed, what happens to their families? That's the question Iraq is grappling with as Daesh's territory dwindles and families of the fighters are left behind. According to a Reuters report, almost 1,500 foreign wives and children of suspected Daesh militants are being detained at a camp south of Mosul. The government in Baghdad appears to be at a loss at what to do with them. Sandra Gatman has more.
Who is innocent? Who is the enemy? It's a question Iraqi forces continue to face as they battle Daesh. With every retaken town, soldiers comb through the fleeing crowds looking for Daesh fighters. But there are fears that their families, mostly women and children, are being swept up in the crackdown. Last month, the city of Tel Afar was recaptured by Iraqi forces. Over 1,400 women and children suspected of being relatives of Daesh members were handed over and taken to a camp in Hammam Alil. They were then moved on to another camp, 10 kilometers north of Mosul in Tel Kaif. This is the detention site where Daesh family members are being held. Rights groups say conditions inside are unhygienic, that women and children aren't free to move around, and say their detention goes against international law. NGOs say the women and children are mostly foreign nationals from at least 13 countries who traveled to Iraq with their husbands to live under Daesh rule. But many were found without identification. Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi insists most are not guilty of crimes, although his government is under growing pressure to start trials for the detained wives. As for the young children, rights groups fear that with some countries refusing to take them back, many will be stuck in detention and stateless, paying for the crimes of their fathers with their future. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Geneva by Francesco Motta. He's the chief of the Middle East branch at the UN Human Rights Office and a former representative of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Iraq. And from Washington, D.C., Ismail Sudani. He's a retired brigadier general with the Iraqi army and a former Iraqi defense attaché to the United States. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Francesco Motta, let me begin with you. What should Iraq be doing with these more than 1,400 people?
Well, the situation is actually very complicated because we have to put it into the context in which the conflict in Iraq has been taking place. It's a highly urbanized conflict where people have been engaged in committing various violations of human rights from the side of the Daesh in particular, where they're not clearly identified as being fighters, etc. So in the context of this conflict, it has been expected that the Iraqi government does have an obligation to ensure that civilians they're encountering, or people who are saying they're civilians are in fact civilians, that they may not have committed any crimes and that they actually may pose no risk to security. So the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Human Rights Office of the Assistance Mission in Iraq anticipated this very issue. And we made very strong representations to the government that in the process of the campaigns, they would probably encounter large numbers of women and children, and they had to meet certain minimum standards in terms of their humanitarian support, but also in terms of ensuring their legal rights and their protections generally. What we are concerned about is that because of the nature of what's taken place in Iraq, there's a lot of people who have had family members who are victims, and they may in fact take it into their heads to take justice into their own hands. And we fear that a lot of people who are associated with ISIL fighters, particularly their family members, women and children, could well be targeted for serious harm by people in revenge for what's happened to them in return. So it's a very complicated issue of balancing the protection, but also maintaining their rights and ensuring, of course, that they are given adequate standards of humanitarian assistance. In this case, and going on from the report that I just heard, we had information that the 1,500 or so women and children, which are around 650 women and nearly 900 children, are actually identified as foreigners. And some of the problems that they're facing is that a lot of them, as was mentioned in the report, don't have documentation. And so identifying exactly where they come from, despite their claims of being foreign nationals, is sometimes hard to ascertain. So at the moment, we understand that the government is undertaking security vetting of these individuals, but that once they're cleared, they will be, in fact, notified to their consulates, and the consulates, therefore, will be able to take action, provided, of course, the individuals concerned haven't been found to have committed crimes or other violations under Iraqi law. Our bottom line, though, is, of course, at all times, civilians, people who claim to be civilians, should be protected and respected at all times, and they should assume to be civilians until proven otherwise, particularly the case of the children, because we know the children themselves can't be involved in any actions that were untowards or constituted violations of Iraqi law. So we are particularly concerned about the children and the standards in which these children are being cared for.
Yeah.
So the longer it goes on, the greater concerns we have.
Yeah, certainly, and unequivocally, the children are innocent. Let me ask Ismail Sudani, let me bring you in here, and let me ask you if it was a bad idea to have these people who are the families of Daesh in the same camps as people who are under the heel of Daesh, people who suffered under Daesh, people who starved, people who were oppressed by Daesh. Isn't that a recipe for reprisals and all manner of problems?
If they are, detained in the same camps, I don't think so. This is an appropriate approach to put them together, because people who are suffering from Daesh are furious, and they may take revenge against them. So I think the responsibility of the Iraq government to put them in a separate camp to protect them. If not, even they are innocent and they don't have any crimes against humanity, and they didn't perpetrate any kind of crimes against the civilians, which they have found, in fact, in an area that under the ISIS control, they are affiliated to ISIS. So we do not know for sure whether they are associated to the crimes that committed by ISIS to the minorities and ethnicities in the area, like Yazidis and some other minorities. So in this case, it's Iraqi government is responsible towards, and committed to the international community to provide, not to release them right now until they investigate and interrogate them. We don't know, never know what they are, what they charges are. And Iraqi government should work with the international coalition to interrogate them, because they are representing a valuable, sources of intelligence. Still, the campaign to eradicate ISIS is ongoing. And there are lots of, ISIS elements are outside Iraq, and they need to be followed by the international community. Iraq does not want to leave them and release them, and there would be no country would receive them, or they release them internally to the locals, so they would, humiliate them, they would kill them. Iraq should protect them, even there would be no legal procedures against them.
Okay.
Again, they are foreigners. They are not relevant to the area where they have been caught.
Okay.
And therefore they are responsible.
Allow me to come in here, and yes. you made your point very clearly. Let's have a little listen to a Peshmerga fighter. Now, for a lot of them, the Peshmerga had actually caught them and handed them over to the Iraqi army. This is what we heard from the Peshmerga. Have a little listen.
In fact, these displaced people who turn themselves in, they're not displaced people. They're all Daesh, and they all wore explosive belts, and these are the belts in front of you.
Let me ask you, Francesco, so you have the Peshmerga from among them saying, some of them had explosive belts. There were reports following some of the work of Janan Musa, where she interviewed some of these Daesh wives. Some of them seemed very complicit in the slave market, especially when it comes to, raping Yazidi girls and so on. So you have a certain amount of people who were complicit in crimes, and they were active members of Daesh. You have their children who are absolutely innocent, right? And then you have a lot of other people who might have been swept up in the situation. When it comes to actually vetting people in a security sense, do you, Francesco, trust that the Iraqis are able to sort of pass this out and figure out who's an active member of Daesh, who's not, who was just swept up, who would be responsible for crimes and who would not. How does this work, Francesco?
Well, in fact, I was last in the area of Mosul in May this year, and I did meet with a number of the security agencies who are responsible for doing this sort of vetting. The Daesh actually were quite meticulous about documenting who their members were, and in many cases they left behind officers with large volumes of information, including application forms and membership forms, photographs, details of addresses, names, birthplaces, etc., of people who were affiliated or associated with them. And basically the categories have been arranged according to a person's level of involvement with the Daesh as to whether they were a fighter, whether they were an administrator, whether they were a supporter, were they a member of the Al-Khansa in relation to some of the women, and then of course whether or not they are individually linked with having committed any sort of violations, crimes or atrocities. Now, as I said, this is a process, and the government does of course have an obligation to ensure that people who have committed crimes are brought to justice, but they also have an obligation to respect due process and fair trial standards, to ensure, for example, that those who are being detained and who will ultimately be charged there is in fact evidence to warrant such charges, and in the meantime people should be assumed to be innocent and should given all the cares and protections that civilians deserve in that context. As I said, it's a very delicate and tricky situation given the environment in northern Iraq, where a lot of people have suffered from violations at the hands of the Daesh. People want to see vengeance or revenge or sometimes justice for those crimes that were perpetrated against them. So you've got to balance the obligation of the state to protect these people, but also to provide them from due process. And of course the physical environment up there has largely been destroyed. A lot of the infrastructure has been destroyed, and so it's extremely difficult. We've spoken to some of other of the agencies who do have access to this particular caseload, who assured us that their basic humanitarian needs were being met. But as I said, the longer it goes on, the more concerns we have that some of these women and children may end up in a limbo, particularly if they're not going to be charged formally. What's going to happen to them? Without documentation, will their countries accept them and take them home? And of major concern is the children, because, as I said, children are innocent in all of this. And we have to extend this outwards to understand that there are hundreds of thousands of children in the north of Iraq who've been subjected to years, a number of years, of Daesh indoctrination. And we also have to look at how those children's needs are going to be met in terms of basic services, education, healthcare, etc., to rehabilitate these children and to rebuild their communities. So this is a narrow question in relation to this particular caseload, but it's also a question that has to be raised in relation to the larger population of the north of Iraq. And the government is confronting some very serious problems in relation to that, and as I hope that the international community will be there to assist find some of the solutions for those problems.
Ismail Sudani, what will the Iraqi government do if these countries don't want to take these people back? I mean, there's a kaleidoscope of countries that have been mentioned, and a lot of the time it's guesswork from the people who are interacting with them, because they're basing it on the languages that they're hearing in the camps, and sometimes people are saying they're from a certain country, but they're not actually from that country, and so on. So it might be an international diplomatic mess, especially if many of these countries don't want to take them back. What's the Iraqi government going to do?
Well, I think Iraq government should put the international community and the organizations, international organizations, in front of their responsibilities to take over this kind of challenges that pose on Iraq and the national security of Iraq. Daesh is not a normal criminal organization. It is designated as international terrorist groups. And there is a coalition, international coalition now campaigning ISIS to eradicate it. And there are lots of threats to all over the world, in Europe and in America and in Asia. Everywhere we can see there is a threat of Daesh and that particular acts of against humanity. That's why I think Iraq government is cooperating with the UN and has forwarded a letter on August asking the international organization to help the Iraqi government in investigating the ISIS, crimes and their, acts against humanity and what they have done in Iraq as well. And I think the United Nations has responded with Security Council Resolution 2379, which has been issued on September 19th, or I don't know exactly the date, but that means that Iraqi government should work with the international community, should work with the international organization to solve this complicated issue.
Right.
I don't think so that those countries, their home countries, would deny their identity. In this case, Iraq should, make the United Nations organization responsible of these. If they are not, if they are proved they are victims, they are misled by their ISIS husbands elements. We don't know yet, because the investigation would prove whether they have perpetrated crimes against humanity. And I have, read, in the last days, a report saying that one lady, her husband was released, an enslaved girl. That means she was part of this kind of crimes against humanity.
Yes.
And they, with their intention, they were, traveling to Iraq and to participate with Daesh and be part of the jihad, presumably al-jihad, that what ISIS claim to act in a austerious way.
Right. Francesco, Iraq has the death penalty on the books. Being a member of ISIS means that you're likely to face the death penalty in Iraq. If you're a Daesh member, if they convict you, do you trust the Iraqi justice system to be just and fair when it comes to this issue? Because we've seen Haider al-Abadi calling for more executions. He said that last year he wants more executions of Daesh members. So do you trust them?
Well, we, as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, of course, stand opposed to the death penalty, and we've been taking this issue up very strongly with the government of Iraq, considering that we have ourselves, and I myself have witnessed weaknesses in the administration of justice in Iraq, and we do have concerns about compliance with international due process and fair trial standards. There does seem to be a reliance on confessions for the Iraqi judicial processes, which I've personally witnessed and monitored a number of trials where I've seen this happen, and particularly counter-terrorism trials. And we've been working very strongly, very closely with the authorities in Iraq to try and get legislative reforms that would guarantee respect for due process and fair trial standards. The other side of this, of course, is that Iraq has not yet introduced legislation which criminalises international crimes within the domestic jurisdiction. And of course, the first responsibility, the primacy of responsibility in terms of protection in reference to respecting these due process and fair trial standards, but also in terms of accountability and justice, must rest with the government of Iraq. So we've pressed the government of Iraq to consider legal reforms that would ensure respect for international standards and that would also criminalise international crimes, such as crimes against humanity, war crimes and acts of genocide within the domestic jurisdictions. At the moment, most people who are being charged under the anti-terrorism law of 2005. That law does not require really due process or fair trial standards in terms of its application, and it also is worded in a rather vague or broad manner. And we do have concerns that in this context, people may have death sentences passed against them where the evidence against them may not be strong. It may rest solely on a confession which is claimed to have been induced through forced or induced through torture or malpractice.
Right.
And for crimes that aren't the most serious crimes in terms of loss of life. So, of course, we've pressed the government of Iraq that what we would like to see is a moratorium on the death penalty. And I know this is really difficult in the circumstances of what Iraq has been through. But what we're asking for is real justice.
Okay,
we don't think that families who've been the victims of the Daesh will have justice if innocent people are punished for those crimes.
Okay, because we're running out of time, I want to get a final response from Ismail to that. And the point was emphatically made. Ismail, isn't that reasonable? Moratorium on the death penalty for now, because this is a big mess, and the UN is saying the Iraqi justice system, when trying to deal with this, especially with such a powerful tool as the death penalty, is weak and might not be able to mete out proper justice. Is a moratorium maybe the right thing to do, Ismail?
Well, I think that's, although we convinced that Iraqi justice maybe is weak, not very strong enough to impose law and order in the as Iraq designated as a fragile state, yes, but there would be unequivocal, undeniable evidences for any terrorist if he has affiliated to ISIS and committed the crimes against the civilians in Iraq, and therefore there would be no any I think objections to be tried in the Iraqi judiciary system, and there would be no objection from the international community. Maybe they object that the death penalty will be imposed on the accused persons of terrorism. Maybe that's according to the humanitarian or the human rights standards, but we cannot question the Iraqi judiciary system for sentencing those individuals who has participated, who has been part of the formidable, awful organizations that pose a threat to the national security, to the regional and international security, and to do. That is, I think, my answer to this question. Maybe the objection about the death sentence.
Okay, and the question is, will they get a fair trial? I mean, that's at the heart of it all. But I'm out of time. I have to move on. I thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Ismail Sudani and Francesco Motta, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.
So that's my situation, and in fact that's the situation of anybody that's stopped under Schedule 7. There's no suspicion required. You can just be detained. Your rights can be taken away from you even though you're not suspected of a crime.
For many, the right to privacy is a tightly held value. But would you be prepared to go to prison to protect your passwords? A case in the UK has shown that not giving them up to police could be enough to convict you under terror laws. The advocacy group CAGE campaigns against the impact of counter-terrorism policies, and now the director has been snared by them. Mohammed Rabbani was found guilty of obstructing a police search after he refused to hand over the passwords to his phone and laptop. Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act allows officials to stop and search people to determine whether they're preparing a terrorist attack. Rabbani says he was protecting the privacy of a client. To his supporters, he's a modern-day human rights hero who stood up to an unjust law. But British police say these laws are necessary to combat terrorism. Well, I'm joined now by the newsmaker himself, CAGE's International Director, Mohammed Rabbani. Mohammed, good to have you on the Newsmakers. I understand you're on conditional discharge. This got you into a lot of trouble, not wanting to give up your passwords. Obstructing police, that was the conviction. Was it worth all the trouble? Was it worth all the defiance, given that you're going to go to jail and they're going through your stuff anyway?
Thank you for having me here. It was very much worth it. From the outset, many months ago, upon arrest, I took the decision right there that it was the right thing to do. I have to do my very best, all that is within my power, to ensure that I protect the trust of those who've entrusted information, confidential information to me. So at that time, I was willing to risk 3 months in prison for this, in the interest of those torture survivors, but also in the interest of principle. So I'm quite happy, actually, with the outcome. We've won the moral victory. We've done the ethical thing. And I think all those who are in court would agree that it was the law that was the problematic issue in this case.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so you have a problem with Schedule 7 and not just the implementation of Schedule 7?
Yeah, Schedule 7 is a problem at a very, very fundamental way because it operates without any suspicion, which means it's a power that actually operates outside of what we call the rule of law or due process rights. Normally, if your liberty is to be taken away from you or your basic rights are to be deprived, there has to be a suspicion at least, if not evidence and charges made against a person. Schedule 7 operates completely without this safeguard, and therefore it's a very, very problematic power.
do you believe that there was zero suspicion when it comes to the fact that you're a director of Cage, and Cage has had, you've used the word problematic, has had a problematic relationship with the government in recent times?
No, not at all. Actually, suspicion is in relation to criminal activity. There's no suspicion against Cage or me. In fact, it was admitted to and confirmed by 3 police officers in open court. There was no suspicion against myself. And as for Cage, Cage is not a problem either. The police have had no interest in Cage. The police have never investigated Cage or accused us of anything. In fact, they've actually made appointments with us, come to our office, and discussed many issues together around the table. Cage is a problem for, however, the Home Office and also the neoconservatives who are propelling a particular narrative which promotes war abroad and also discriminatory and oppressive policies in the Western countries, including the UK.
Okay, so let me separate this out, right? So we'll talk about Cage in a second, but at the time, do you regret maybe being uncooperative with the police officer, given that in court, you know, they said that you refused to tell officers what you did for a living, telling them it won't help you in any way. You said you had a right to privacy, which of course you do. PC Tariq Chowdhury, who conducted the search, said, quote, I asked him questions about his occupation. He said he was a director of a company but wouldn't go any further. He kept saying you don't need to and it won't help you in any way. And then perhaps they Google search you and they find that you're the director of Cage. Now, with that in mind, do you regret not being cooperative with them at that moment in time? Why didn't you just say, hey, I'm a director of Cage?
Yeah, actually, in open court, all 3 police officers confirmed that they had full knowledge I was the director of Cage before they even stopped me.
Right.
And therefore, that's not the issue. The issue is that they were asking for my passwords, and I refused on the principled reason that I cannot hand over information that belongs to someone else without their consent.
Okay, so when we say suspicion, now again, I'm not suggesting criminal activity here. I'm trying to get into their minds a little bit here, trying to understand the zeitgeist, right? So it comes to Cage. We have a history with Mwazi at a time when Boris Johnson, now the Foreign Secretary, then the London Mayor, had called Cage apologists for terror because Asim Qureshi called him a beautiful young man. Mwazi was Jihadi John, who beheaded James Foley in Syria. Cage's website still has a page up for Anwar al-Awlaki, campaigning for him. At the time of death, it was unanimously agreed upon that Awlaki was the head of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So with those things in mind, would you accept that the government's keeping an eye on Cage and that you gave them a nice pretext when these guys knew who you were, you come through an airport, and from their perspective, they want to prevent another Mwazi, they want to prevent another terror attack because they feel you might be close to this in some way. And then you say, I don't need to tell you who I work for. And it maybe just aggravates the situation.
Not at all. There's a few hysterical connections that are being made there, so I need to clear some of them up. The ACLU actually defended Anwar al-Awlaki after he was killed in a drone strike extrajudicially. The headmaster and the employer of Mwazi actually called him a gentleman. It wasn't just Cage. And the leader of her opposition, Her Majesty's opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, has actually been called a terrorist sympathiser. So it's nothing to do with actual the names and the labels. The issue here is it's a legal power, and for the law to operate, it needs to operate lawfully, and it has to be consistent with rule of law. So Schedule 7, as we have been saying for many years, operates outside of those powers. It needs to be brought in line. Safeguards need to be brought in line. Nobody's actually going to argue against having powers to protect national security. This is not what we're saying at all. What we're saying is that those powers need to be very sensible, intelligent, and proportionate. You cannot stop 20,000 people last year and then only arrest 5. That means, who are you stopping? You're stopping innocent people and making their lives a misery. So it's not actually working either. It's actually a useless power. What it's good at is gathering mass intelligence on innocent people going about their daily business, going to holiday or coming back from work.
Very finally, you're going to appeal. What makes you so confident that you'll win?
We're confident because there's actually a growing recognition across the world, not just here in the UK, We have, again, in America, in Donald Trump's America, the ACLU bringing a very powerful legal challenge only 2 weeks ago. And we believe that people are recognizing there's real overreach here happening under the pretext of fighting terrorism. There's actually serious erosion of civil liberties taking place. And people are realizing that we can't have this anymore. So principle is important, morality is important, ethics are important, and the law has to be consistent with those fundamental principles.
Mohammed Rabbani, good to talk to you on the Newsmakers. I thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us, especially given that you're on conditional discharge at the moment. Thanks again. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Until then, thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.